world had been reduced to a single primal truth. To be captured was to have your soul erased. This was the promise, the warning, hammered into the mind of every woman and child on the island of Saipan in the summer of 1944. It wasn't just a military directive, it was a spiritual certainty, a law of the universe as immutable as the tides. The Americans, they were told, were not men. They were Oni, hulking, red-haired demons with blue eyes that promised a defilement so complete, so monstrous that death was an honorable and necessary escape. Sachiko, a young schoolteacher who had once dreamed of poetry, now clutched a sharpened piece of bamboo, her mind reciting the litany of horrors taught to her by the Imperial command. She envisioned monsters, not soldiers. She pictured claws, not hands. The propaganda posters were seared into her memory, grotesque caricatures of grinning beasts dragging away screaming Japanese women, their honor shredded like their kimonos. This was the only future she could see, the only reality she was prepared for. The choice was simple and stark: a clean death by her own hand, or a fate that would make the underworld seem a paradise. The central question wasn't if she would die, but if she would have the courage to do it before the demons found her. For weeks, this worldview was reinforced by the hellish symphony of war. The sky bled fire, and the ground shuddered with the constant, concussive thunder of American naval guns. The air, thick with the metallic tang of cordite and the sweet, sickly smell of death, was a testament to the invaders' destructive power. Everything the commanders had said seemed to be coming true. This was an extermination. The demons were burning their world to ash. Sachiko and the other women huddled in the suffocating humidity of a limestone cave, listening to the world being unmade outside. They shared stories, not of hope, but of resolve. An older woman, a grandmother, spoke calmly about the correct way to press the blade to the throat to ensure a quick end. A teenage girl, barely 16, worried her hands wouldn't be strong enough to detonate the grenade she had been given. Their terror wasn't of the Americans as a military force, but as a supernatural one. They weren't fighting an army. They were bracing for an apocalypse of personal violation. Their collective identity was built on a shared sacred duty to protect their purity, the last bastion of the Japanese spirit, by ensuring their bodies were never taken. Their fear was absolute, their certainty unwavering. The world outside the cave was ending, and their only remaining control was how they would exit it. The inciting incident was not a clash of steel or a roar of rage. It was silence. After a final deafening crescendo of explosions that shook dust and pebbles from the cave ceiling, the world outside fell quiet. The silence was more terrifying than the noise. It was a predator's stillness, the pause before the final pounce. Sachiko's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat in the sudden void. Then a shadow fell across the mouth of the cave. It wasn't the squat, horned figure of her imagination. It was impossibly tall, a giant silhouetted against the blinding tropical sun. It moved slowly, cautiously. A voice, deep and utterly alien, called out in broken, guttural Japanese. "Dedekoi, daijobu, water, mizu, come out, it's okay, water." The words were nonsense, a trick. The demon was trying to lure them out. The women shrank back into the darkness, a collective gasp of fear sucking the air from the cave. Sachiko's hand trembled, her grip tightening on the bamboo spear. This was it, the moment of final resolve. The giant shadow knelt, placing something on the ground just outside the cave entrance, a metal canteen. Then it backed away, its hands held up in a gesture she didn't understand. It wasn't the aggressive, grasping motion of a monster. It was something else, something disturbingly, terrifyingly passive. For an hour they waited. The canteen sat glinting in the sunlight, a silent, baffling invitation. Thirst was a living thing inside Sachiko, a clawing creature in her throat. The children in the cave had long since stopped crying. their whimpers now just dry, rasping coughs. The initial shock began to curdle into a profound and unnerving confusion. The demons were supposed to storm the caves, to drag them out by their hair to relish in their terror. They were not supposed to offer water and wait patiently. Another soldier appeared, this one with hair the color of sand. He didn't carry a weapon, but a canvas bag with a red cross painted on it. He knelt beside a man at the cave's edge, who had collapsed from a shrapnel wound to his leg days before. The man flinched, preparing for the death blow. Instead, the American soldier gently cut away the blood-caked fabric of his trousers. He poured a clear liquid from a bottle onto the wound, and the man hissed in pain. But it was the clean, sharp pain of antiseptic, not the brutal agony of a bayonet. The soldier worked with a focused calm, wrapping the leg in clean white bandages. He performed this act of healing with an impersonal efficiency that was more shocking than any act of cruelty could have been. This was the first tremor that cracked the foundations of their world. The reality they were witnessing was simply impossible to reconcile with the certainty they had been given. These creatures, these Oni, were behaving like doctors, like men. They moved with a purpose that was not rooted in bloodlust. One of them found a small child, a little girl who had wandered out of the cave, paralyzed by fear. The giant American knelt down, his body seeming to fold in on itself to make himself smaller. He offered her a small foil-wrapped square of chocolate. The girl stared, her eyes wide with a terror so pure it left no room for tears. But the soldier didn't grab her. He didn't snarl. He simply smiled, a strange, clumsy expression, and placed the chocolate on the ground before backing away. Sachiko watched, her mind a whirlwind of cognitive dissonance. The promised horrors, the brutal violations, the animalistic rage, it was all absent. In its place was this quiet, bizarre, and incomprehensible display of restraint. It wasn't kindness, not yet. It was something far more unsettling. It was a complete and total invalidation of everything she had prepared for. The spear in her hand suddenly felt heavy, absurd. Her worldview hadn't just been challenged. It had been rendered meaningless in the face of a quiet canteen and a gentle, bandaging hand. The surrender was a slow, agonizing crawl out of the darkness and into a world they no longer recognized. Herded by the strange, towering soldiers, Sachiko and the other survivors began a forced march away from the caves. Every step was laced with dread. Now, Sachiko thought, the true horror begins. The march would be the perfect opportunity for the promised brutality. She watched the soldiers' hands, expecting them to lash out at any moment. She saw them approach an old man who had stumbled and fallen to his knees, too weak to continue. Sachiko squeezed her eyes shut, bracing for the crack of a rifle butt against his skull. Instead, she heard a grunt of effort. She opened her eyes to see two soldiers lift the old man by his arms, half carrying him between them. They weren't gentle. Their movements were rough and impatient. But it was the impatience of men on a schedule, not the sadism of monsters. A young boy, no older than 5, began to cry hysterically, his bare feet bleeding on the sharp volcanic rock. A Marine, his face grim and streaked with sweat and dirt, simply scooped the boy up and threw him over his shoulder like a sack of rice, continuing the march without breaking stride. This wasn't cruelty, and it wasn't kindness. It was a perplexing, pragmatic humanity that chipped away further at Sachiko's certainty. They arrived at a sprawling camp of canvas tents, a makeshift city enclosed by barbed wire. This, they thought, was the pen where the slaughter would take place. They were segregated, men in one area, women and children in another. The guards who watched them didn't leer or taunt. They stood at a distance, their faces bored, chewing gum and smoking cigarettes. The first meal was the next test. The women huddled together as a soldier dumped crates onto the ground. Inside were small green tins and boxes of hard pale crackers. K-rations. This was the demon's food. Some women refused to eat, convinced it was poisoned, but the children, driven by a hunger that knew no politics, began to gnaw on the crackers. Sachiko, her own stomach aching with emptiness, watched them. They didn't fall ill. Tentatively, she opened a tin of processed meat. The smell was foreign, fatty and salty, nothing like the subtle flavors of home. But it was food. It was sustenance. The Americans weren't starving them. They were feeding them, methodically and impersonally, the same food they themselves ate. The act was so devoid of malice, so utterly bureaucratic, that it felt more disorienting than any act of aggression. They were being treated not as trophies of war to be violated, but as a logistical problem to be managed. The first major reconstructed anecdote began with a sound that cut through the low hum of the camp, the weak, desperate wail of a baby. For 2 days, a young mother named Hisai had tried to quiet her infant son, who burned with a fever that left him limp and unresponsive. In the caves, this would have been a death sentence. Here, it was a source of pure terror. Hisai clutched the baby to her chest, hiding in the back of her tent, convinced the soldiers would see the child's weakness as an impurity to be stamped out. She had been taught that the Oni devoured children. When an American medic, a young man with kind eyes and a stethoscope around his neck, appeared at her tent, she began to shake uncontrollably. He spoke in slow, simple English, pointing at the baby. "Sick? Let me see. Baby sick?" Hisai saw only a monster reaching for her son. She screamed, a raw, animal sound of defiance, shielding the baby with her own body. Other women gathered, their faces tight with fear, expecting to witness the horror they had all been promised. The medic stopped, holding up his hands. He didn't force his way in. He simply knelt, opened his medical bag, and began laying out supplies on a clean cloth with painstaking slowness. This was the moment where the two worlds collided. Hisai's mind was a storm of propaganda, a lifetime of warnings screaming at her to protect her child from the demon, but her eyes saw something else. They saw the medic's calm hands, the sterile glint of a thermometer, the gentle way he poured water into a cup and crushed a small white pill into it. Sachiko watched, frozen, as the standoff continued for nearly an hour. The baby's cries grew weaker, shallower. Finally, something broke in Hisai. The instinct of a mother, more powerful than any indoctrination, took over. Her son was dying. With a sob that tore from the depths of her soul, she slowly, hesitantly loosened her grip and allowed the medic to approach. He didn't snatch the baby. He touched the infant's forehead with the back of his hand, his movements gentle and practiced. He showed Hisai the thermometer, showed her the high temperature. He used a dropper to put the mixture of water and medicine into the baby's mouth, a few drops at a time. All afternoon he sat with her, cooling the baby's skin with a damp cloth. He was no longer a monster. He was just a healer fighting a fever. By nightfall, the baby's fever had broken. The child was sleeping peacefully, breathing without the ragged gasp that had signaled his imminent death. The medic gave Hisai more medicine and showed her how to use it, then left without a word. The event sent a shockwave through the women's section of the camp. They had just witnessed the absolute, undeniable demolition of their most sacred terror. The Americans were not baby eaters, they were baby savers. For Sachiko, this was the turning point. The image of the giant American soldier gently tending to the tiny Japanese infant was a truth so powerful it burned away the lies. The foundation of her world, built on the certainty of American evil, crumbled into dust. All the other acts, the water, the bandages, the food, were ambiguous. But this was a fundamental act of creation, of preservation. It was the antithesis of everything a demon was supposed to be. Her entire reality had been a phantom, a story told to ensure she would die. What does a person do when they discover the monster they were taught to fear as the face of a savior? The collapse of their worldview was not a gentle dawn, but a violent earthquake that left behind a landscape of psychological ruin. The relief of survival was immediately suffocated by a profound and corrosive shame. Sachiko looked at the faces of the women around her and saw the same hollowness reflected in their eyes. They had been so certain, so arrogant in their commitment to a noble death. They had judged those who were captured, whispering about their weakness and dishonor. Now, they were the weak ones. They were the dishonored. Sachiko thought of her friends, 2 other young teachers who had leaped from the cliffs at Marpy Point, their hands clasped together as they followed the military's orders to the letter. They had chosen death to avoid the phantom demons, while Sachiko now sat on an American blanket, eating American food, saved by the very monsters they had fled. The grief was staggering. It was a dual grief, for her lost friends, and for the lie they died for. Their sacrifice, which once seemed the pinnacle of honor, now felt like a tragic, senseless waste, orchestrated by their own leaders. The Americans had not taken their lives or their honor. Their own government had coerced them into throwing both away. This internal crisis deepened as the days turned into weeks. The camp, once seen as a holding pen for death, transformed into a place of bizarre normalcy. The soldiers were no longer giants or demons. They became individuals. There was the guard who always tried to trade his cigarettes for handcrafted trinkets, the cook who would slip extra fruit to the children, the medic who knew every child's name. They were young men, far from home, bored, tired, and sometimes kind. This humanization of the enemy was the most profound attack on their identity. If the Americans were just men, then what did that make the Japanese soldiers who had told them otherwise? What did that make the emperor, in whose name they were meant to die? The propaganda had presented a world of black and white, of spiritual purity versus demonic evil. The reality was a confusing, uncomfortable gray. They had been prepared to fight gods and monsters, an epic struggle for the soul of their nation. Instead, they had been defeated by ordinary men with superior logistics, and were now being cared for with an efficiency that felt almost insulting. The grand, noble war they had believed in shrank into something ugly, pathetic, and pointless. The emotional climax for Sachiko arrived in the form of a quiet woman named Mary. She was a Nisei, a second-generation Japanese-American, serving as a translator for the U.S. military. She had a kind, weary face and spoke a perfect, formal Japanese that felt like a relic from another time. One afternoon she sat with Sachiko, helping her fill out administrative forms. The questions were simple: name, age, home village, but they felt impossibly heavy. Seeing an opportunity, Sachiko's own question, the one that had been poisoning her from the inside, finally spilled out. Her voice was a bare whisper. Why? Why are you not like they said? Mary looked up from her clipboard, her expression unreadable. Sachiko, emboldened by the woman's calm, confessed everything. She spoke of the Oni, the promise of unspeakable violation, the sharpened bamboo spear she had hidden in her clothes, intended first for an American and then for herself. She expected to see disgust or anger in Mary's eyes. She was confessing a murderous intent, admitting that she had seen this woman and people like her as less than human. Who is the greater enemy? The one who points a gun at you, or the one who convinces you to point it at yourself for their own cause? Mary listened patiently until Sachiko's confession trailed off into a choked silence. She didn't recoil. She didn't judge. Instead, a look of profound sadness crossed her face. They told us you would not surrender, Mary said softly. They said you would all fight to the last woman and child, that you were fanatics who saw death as a victory. In that moment, Sachiko understood. The same machine that had painted the Americans as demons had painted the Japanese as inhuman fanatics. Both sides were trapped in a narrative designed to make killing easier, to make mercy impossible. Mary then shared her own story of being an American citizen, of her family being forced from their home in California into an internment camp in the desert, viewed with suspicion by their own country. War, Mary concluded, her voice heavy, makes monsters of men, but sometimes the most dangerous monsters are the stories we tell ourselves. The confession had not brought condemnation. It had brought a shared, tragic understanding. Sachiko was not just a defeated enemy, she was a fellow victim of the same global madness, a pawn in a game played by powerful men who had never set foot on her island. This conversation was the final, definitive realignment of Sachiko's soul. The shame did not vanish, but it was transformed. The target of her anger shifted from herself to the architects of the lie. She finally saw the truth with searing clarity. The Imperial command had not been trying to protect her honor. They had been using it as a tool of war. A civilian population that commits mass suicide is a powerful propaganda weapon. It proves the enemy's brutality and reinforces the narrative of a holy war. Her life and the lives of her friends were considered expendable ammunition in a psychological battle. The ultimate betrayal was not facing a cruel enemy, but discovering that her own leaders had counted on one, and when it didn't exist, they were happy to let their people die for a fiction. Her old reality, a world of honor, duty, and noble sacrifice, was gone forever. It was replaced by a new, shocking, and deeply cynical truth. She'd been a prisoner of her own side long before she ever saw an American soldier. Her capture wasn't the end of her freedom. It was the beginning of it. The story of Sachiko and the women in the camp did not end with the breaking of a fever or the quiet confession to a translator. It ended with a slow, disorienting return to the living. In the months that followed, as the war shuddered to its violent conclusion, the camp became a strange purgatory between a world that was dead and one that was not yet born. They learned basic English. They taught their children songs that had no memory of war attached to them. They began to see the future not as a black wall of honorable death, but as a blank page. When they were finally repatriated to mainland Japan, they stepped into the ruins of their former nation. It was a country starved, broken, and occupied. A populace grappling with the same profound betrayal they had experienced months earlier. But Sachiko and the other survivors had a head start. They had already endured the death of their sacred world. They had already learned the bitter lesson that the highest authorities could be the most prolific liars. While their countrymen reeled from the Emperor's declaration of humanity, Sachiko saw it as a confirmation of the truth she had been forced to learn in a barbed wire enclosure on a remote island, that men, not gods, had sent them to die. The legacy of what happened on Saipan, Okinawa, and other islands became a chilling postscript to the Pacific War. It stands as one of history's most stark examples of the power of psychological warfare, not against the enemy, but against one's own people. The Imperial Japanese government had successfully weaponized its citizens' honor, turning their virtues of loyalty and duty into instruments of self-destruction. The universal truth laid bare by the experience of these women is that dehumanization is the engine of all conflict. They were conditioned to see the Americans as inhuman beasts, a belief that made suicide a logical choice. The American soldiers, in turn, were conditioned to see the Japanese as fanatical zealots, making mercy seem a foolish risk. And yet, in that space between two opposing narratives, something else emerged. The simple, human acts of offering water, bandaging a wound, or saving a child became revolutionary. They dismantled the propaganda more effectively than any bomb. It proved that the most powerful weapon in any war is not the one that takes a life, but the one that affirms it. For nothing unravels a narrative of hate faster than an unexpected act of grace. In the end, the story of the Japanese women who were stunned by the absence of brutality is not about the unique virtue of one army or the unique evil of another. It is a story about the fragile boundary between our programming and our humanity. For weeks, the women of Saipan lived in a world meticulously constructed by their leaders, a world that demanded their deaths. They were saved not by a change in policy, but by the accumulation of small, individual choices made by weary soldiers, who, when faced with helpless civilians, chose to be men instead of the monsters they were expected to be. This is the final, powerful lesson. The true shock was not the absence of violence. It was the presence of a mundane, begrudging, yet undeniable decency in the very place they had been promised pure evil. It was the discovery that even in the heart of the 20th century's most brutal war, the fiction of the inhuman other could collapse under the weight of a single, shared human moment. They had prepared themselves for demons, but what they found was far more shocking and ultimately far more hopeful, a reflection of themselves.